in a quiet neighborhood. A small act of kindness would spark a chain of events that no one could have ever predicted. But what if that simple gesture changed everything? What happens when a lonely, forgotten woman is invited to a family's Christmas dinner? How does one act of compassion ignite a fire that burns brighter than anyone could imagine? Timothy, a young boy with a heart full of empathy, unknowingly opens a door that will alter the course of not only his life, but an entire community's future. But here's the twist. This is no ordinary holiday story. It's a tale of generosity, unexpected bonds, and a gift that changes everything. Hold on tight, because you won't want to miss how a single dinner led to a lifetime of transformation. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Timothy Carlson was a 15-year-old boy with an extraordinary belief. Even the smallest act of kindness could illuminate someone's darkest days. Life for the Carlsons had never been easy, but their tiny home was filled with warmth, laughter, and a steadfast determination to face challenges together. His father worked grueling shifts at the factory, often leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark, while his mother juggled sewing and baking jobs to make ends meet. Their Christmas that year would be modest, just like every year, but Timothy never minded. To him, it wasn't the presents that made the holiday, it was the love and unity of his family. One crisp December morning, as the sun cast a silvery glow over the fresh blanket of snow, Timothy slung a bag of trash over his shoulder and trudged down the front steps. His worn boots crunched against the icy ground, a faint puff of his breath visible in the frigid air. Reaching the curb, his eyes drifted to the house next door. It was a little brick house, once lively and full of character, with flower boxes that brimmed with colorful blooms in the spring and cheerful holiday decorations in the winter. But now, the house looked lifeless. The curtains had been drawn for weeks, and the snow on the walkway lay untouched. "That's Miss Finch's place," Timothy murmured to himself. He hadn't seen the elderly widow in quite some time, and the sight of her desolate home sent a wave of concern through him. Mrs. Finch was known to keep to herself, but in their brief interactions, Timothy had always found her kind. He vividly remembered the time when he was younger, and she had handed him a peppermint candy with a gentle smile, saying, "It's nice to be noticed by a young one." Timothy hesitated for a moment, debating whether he should check on her. His heart won the battle. Determined, he marched up to her front door and knocked firmly. For a moment, there was no response, and he almost turned to leave. But then, the door creaked open just slightly, revealing Mrs. Finch's lined face. Her silver hair was loosely tied back, and her pale blue eyes, though weary, regarded him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Yes?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the hesitation of someone not used to visitors. "Hi, Mrs. Finch," Timothy said, flashing his brightest smile. "I live next door. I just wanted to check if you're okay. It's been really cold, and I haven't seen you around." Her eyes widened in surprise at his concern. "Oh, I'm fine, dear," she replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "Just keeping to myself." Timothy hesitated, glancing behind her into the dimly lit interior. The air inside felt heavy, and he couldn't help but notice the thin sweater draped over her frail shoulders. It seemed inadequate for the biting winter cold. "It's really icy out here," he said, stepping back toward the walkway. "I could shovel your path for you, if you'd like." "It won't take long." Mrs. Finch's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the door. "Oh, no. I wouldn't want to trouble you," she said quickly. "It's no trouble at all," Timothy insisted with a reassuring smile. "The shovel's in the shed, right?" After a long pause, Mrs. Finch gave a small nod. "It's behind the house," she murmured. "Thank you, Timothy." He wasted no time retrieving the shovel and getting to work. His movements were brisk and purposeful as he cleared the snow and chipped away the stubborn patches of ice. From behind the curtains, Mrs. Finch watched him quietly, peeking through a small gap. For the first time in what felt like years, a faint smile tugged at her lips. When Timothy finished, he knocked on her door again. "All done," he said cheerfully when she opened it. "Is there anything else I can help with?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, her hands wringing together. Finally, she admitted, "I suppose I could use some help changing a light bulb in the kitchen. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be." "Of course." Timothy followed her inside, his boots squeaking against the old hardwood floor. The house was colder than he had expected, and the air carried a faint mustiness, as though it had been sealed off from the world. He noticed the bare shelves, the sparsely decorated mantelpiece, and a single photograph of a smiling couple, likely from years ago, framed in silver. He quickly swapped out the light bulb, but his curiosity got the better of him. "Mrs. Finch, is your heater working?" he asked, shivering slightly. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's an old house, Timothy. The heater hasn't been working properly for weeks. I've been getting by with blankets and a little space heater, but it's not the same." "Have you called someone to fix it?" he asked gently. She shook her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I can't afford that right now. Retirement doesn't stretch as far as it used to." Timothy felt a pang of sadness, but quickly masked it with a determined smile. "I'll see what I can do about that. I'm no expert, but my dad's great at fixing things." Before he left for school, Timothy made her promise to let him return the next day. "You shouldn't have to deal with everything alone, Mrs. Finch," he said earnestly. She stood in the doorway as he walked away, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. For years, she had convinced herself that the world had forgotten her, that she was merely a relic of the past. But Timothy, his warmth, his smile, his willingness to help, made her wonder if she had been wrong. That evening, Timothy sat at the dinner table, barely touching his bowl of vegetable soup. His parents exchanged concerned glances. "Tim, you've hardly eaten," his mother, Clara, said gently. "Is something bothering you?" He set his spoon down, looking up at her and his father. "It's Mrs. Finch," he began. "I stopped by her house today, and I think she's struggling. Her heater's broken, and she hasn't been eating much. She seems so alone." James and Clara listened intently as he described his visit. When he finished, his mother sighed, her expression softening. "I think she's been like that since her husband passed," Clara said. "I always meant to check in on her, but you know how it is, work, the kids, life. It's easy to lose track of time." "Well, I don't think we can ignore it anymore," Timothy said firmly, his voice resolute. James nodded, a spark of pride in his eyes. "You're right, son. Tomorrow, we'll go together and see how we can help." Timothy noticed a glimmer in her eyes and smiled, hoping she'd say yes. Mrs. Finch took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she replied, "It's been a long time since I've shared Christmas with anyone. I wouldn't want to trouble your family, Timothy." "It's no trouble at all," he said earnestly. "Christmas is about being together, right? You'd actually be doing us a favor by coming. My mom always says the more, the merrier." Mrs. Finch's lips twitched into a faint smile as she looked at the boy standing before her. His enthusiasm and kindness warmed a part of her heart that had long been dormant. "All right," she finally said. "I'll come, but only if you let me bring something to share." Timothy beamed. "Deal. Mom's making her famous roast chicken. So if you have a dessert or something, that would be perfect." "I'll see what I can do," Mrs. Finch said softly. Timothy left her house that morning with a spring in his step, feeling accomplished and excited. Back home, he told his parents about the invitation and they wholeheartedly approved. "That's a wonderful idea," Clara said, pulling out a recipe book to plan the dinner. Henry, meanwhile, was already brainstorming jokes to tell at the table, much to Timothy's mock horror. As Christmas approached, the Carlson household buzzed with activity. Clara cleaned and decorated. Henry repaired an old chair for the dining table, and Timothy made sure the house was warm and inviting. On Christmas morning, he even shoveled Mrs. Finch's walkway again to ensure she had a safe path to their door. When Mrs. Finch arrived that evening, she carried a freshly baked apple pie and wore a dress that, while modest, had an air of elegance. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and her eyes held a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Clara greeted her warmly at the door, taking her coat and ushering her inside. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Finch," she said, her smile genuine. "Please call me Evelyn," Mrs. Finch replied shyly. The living room was cozy and filled with the scent of roasting chicken and cinnamon. A small but lovingly decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights twinkling softly. Timothy proudly introduced her to his younger sister, Abby, who immediately began showing Mrs. Finch her favorite storybooks. Over dinner, the table was alive with laughter and conversation. Henry shared his infamous dad jokes, some of which made Mrs. Finch chuckle despite herself. Clara talked about her baking adventures, and Timothy recounted the soccer match he'd won last season. Evelyn, for the first time in years, found herself truly at ease, her laughter mingling with theirs as she shared stories of her younger days and her late husband's sense of humor. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Finch realized how much she had missed this. Being part of a family, sharing meals, and creating memories. It was a feeling she had thought was lost forever. When it was time for dessert, Evelyn's apple pie stole the show. Clara insisted on getting the recipe, and Abby declared it the best pie she'd ever tasted. "You're going to have to make this every year now," Timothy said, grinning at her. Evelyn smiled, her heart full. "I'd be happy to," she replied. As she walked home later that night, Timothy at her side to ensure she got there safely, Evelyn paused on her doorstep. "Thank you, Timothy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This has been the best Christmas I've had in years." Timothy shrugged modestly. "I'm glad you came. Christmas is better when it's shared." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Your parents have raised a fine young man. Don't ever lose that kind heart of yours." "I won't," he promised. As Timothy walked back to his own house, he looked up at the stars twinkling in the winter sky. That Christmas, he realized, wasn't just about helping Mrs. Finch. It was about opening his heart and learning that even the simplest gestures could make a world of difference. And for Evelyn Finch, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where she no longer felt like the world had forgotten her. Instead, she felt like she belonged again, thanks to the kindness of a boy who had seen past her quiet exterior and reminded her of the joy in connection. Mrs. Finch had looked that night, her laughter and smile staying with him like a treasured memory. It wasn't just the joy of the holiday. It was a connection, the feeling of having made a real difference in someone's life. In the days that followed, Timothy found himself stopping by Mrs. Finch's house more often. Sometimes it was to shovel her walkway or help her with small chores, but other times it was simply to chat. She shared more stories about her life, her adventures with her late husband, and her love of books and music. In return, Timothy told her about his soccer games, his dreams of becoming a teacher, and the little quirks of his family that made them laugh together. The bond between them grew stronger, and Mrs. Finch started to open up in ways Timothy had never expected. She told him about the loneliness she had felt since her husband's passing and how hard it had been to keep going. "But then you came along," she said one afternoon, her voice thick with emotion. "You reminded me that there's still kindness in the world, still people who care." Timothy felt a swell of pride and warmth in his chest. "You don't have to feel alone anymore, Mrs. Finch. We're here for you, and you're part of our family now." As the winter snow began to melt and the days grew longer, Mrs. Finch seemed to find new energy and purpose. Inspired by Timothy's kindness, she started volunteering at the local library, helping organize events and reading to children during story hour. Timothy often stopped by to see her there, grinning as he watched the way the kids gathered around her, captivated by her warm voice and animated storytelling. One day, as they walked home together from the library, Mrs. Finch turned to Timothy with a smile. "You know, you've done more than just clear my walkways or invite me to dinner. You've brought me back to life, Timothy. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. Timothy felt his cheeks flush, but he couldn't help grinning. I didn't do it alone, he said. You just needed someone to remind you how amazing you are. As spring approached, Mrs. Finch became a regular presence at the Carlson home. She joined them for Sunday dinners, taught Abby how to knit, and even helped Clara bake a new recipe for pie. Her laughter became as familiar as the ticking of the old clock in the living room, and her stories added richness to their family's life. For Mrs. Finch, the transformation was profound. She no longer felt like a forgotten relic of the past. Instead, she felt alive, vibrant, and connected to a family that cherished her. And for Timothy, the experience deepened his understanding of kindness and the power of human connection. That Christmas had started as a simple act of kindness, but it grew into something far greater. A bond that transformed not just one lonely woman's life, but also the hearts of an entire family. And as the seasons changed, that bond remained, a testament to the fact that even the smallest gestures of love and care can create ripples that last a lifetime. He needed a reminder of the impact small actions could have. It became a source of motivation, a quiet nudge to always lead with his heart and think beyond himself. In the days following her visit, Mrs. Finch became a regular presence in their lives. She joined the family for dinners, helped Clara in the kitchen, and even shared her wealth of knowledge with Timothy, who discovered that Mrs. Finch had once been a teacher herself. She began tutoring him in subjects he found challenging, turning their small moments together into lessons filled with wisdom and encouragement. "You have such potential, Timothy," she often said. "Your kindness is your greatest strength. Use it wisely, and you'll go far." Timothy worked harder than ever in school, inspired by Mrs. Finch's faith in him. The thought of letting her down was unthinkable. He found himself setting new goals, dreaming bigger dreams, and believing in his ability to make them happen. For Clara and Henry, Mrs. Finch's generosity meant more than financial relief. It strengthened their resolve to instill in their children the values that had brought Mrs. Finch into their lives in the first place: compassion, empathy, and the courage to act on them. As winter turned to spring, the Carlson home became a hub of joy and connection. Mrs. Finch, once reclusive and hesitant, now flourished in their company. Her laughter became a constant sound, her stories a treasured part of their evenings. She even took to gardening again, with Timothy eagerly helping her turn her yard into a vibrant oasis of flowers and vegetables. One warm afternoon, as they planted seeds together, Mrs. Finch looked up from her work. "You've given me a second chance at life, Timothy. I didn't think I had much left to offer the world, but now I see how wrong I was." "You've given me just as much, Mrs. Finch," Timothy replied, brushing dirt off his hands. "You've taught me to dream bigger and believe in myself." The bond between them deepened, rooted in mutual respect and affection. Timothy often thought about the letters she'd written and the trust she had placed in him. It wasn't just about the money for college. It was about the belief that he could make a difference. As the years passed, Timothy grew into the kind-hearted young man Mrs. Finch had always known he would become. He graduated high school with honors and was accepted into a top university, where he planned to study education, inspired by both Mrs. Finch and his desire to give back to others. Through it all, Mrs. Finch remained a guiding presence in his life. She attended his graduation, beaming with pride, and when he left for college, she handed him a small box. Inside was the ornament that read, "Your family too. Take this with you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "So you'll always remember where you came from and the difference you can make." "I'll never forget," Timothy promised, holding the ornament close. Years later, as Timothy stood in front of a classroom full of eager faces, he often thought of Mrs. Finch. Her kindness had set his life on a new course, and her faith in him had given him the confidence to chase his dreams. Back in their small town, Mrs. Finch continued to thrive, surrounded by friends she'd made through her volunteer work and the Carlson family, who remained as close to her as ever. Her simple act of generosity had created a ripple effect. touching countless lives and proving that the greatest gifts are often those that come from the heart. And for Timothy, it was a reminder that even the smallest kindness could spark a lifetime of change. He needed motivation. Mrs. Finch, now a regular visitor to the Carlson home, began to flourish in ways none of them could have predicted. She joined a knitting circle at the community center, reconnecting with old acquaintances and even making new friends. Timothy often found her regaling Clara with stories of her youth or laughing at Henry's unending stream of dad jokes. "You've brought life back into this house, Eleanor," Clara said one evening as they sat knitting together by the fire. "And you've brought it back into me," Mrs. Finch replied, her smile warm and genuine. As the months turned into years, Timothy worked harder than ever in school, knowing that Mrs. Finch's belief in him wasn't something to take lightly. Her generosity became the fuel that pushed him through tough classes and late-night study sessions. Every achievement, whether acing a difficult math test or being accepted into an advanced placement program, felt like a shared victory between him and the woman who had become like a grandmother to him. Mrs. Finch, in turn, took immense pride in Timothy's accomplishments. She framed his certificates and proudly showed them off to her friends. "That boy," she'd often say, "is going to change the world one day." On Timothy's 16th birthday, the family hosted a modest celebration at home. Mrs. Finch arrived early, carrying a cake she had baked herself. The frosting was slightly uneven, evidence of her still developing baking skills, but Timothy didn't care. "Happy birthday, my dear boy," she said, hugging Timothy tightly. "I hope you're ready for another year of adventures." "I'm ready for whatever comes next," Timothy replied, grinning. As the evening progressed, Timothy made an announcement that left everyone beaming with pride. "I've been thinking about what I want to do in the future," he began, glancing at Mrs. Finch. "And I think I've decided I want to study social work. I want to help people the way all of you have helped me. And the way we helped Eleanor." Mrs. Finch's hand flew to her chest, her eyes misting. "Oh, Timothy, you'll be wonderful at it. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Years passed, and Timothy pursued his dreams with unwavering determination. Mrs. Finch's initial gift, combined with the love and support of his family, helped him earn a scholarship to university, where he studied social work. Throughout his college years, he visited Mrs. Finch often, sharing stories about his classes and internships. "You're doing amazing things, Timothy," she'd say after every visit, "and I'll always be cheering you on." When Timothy graduated with honors, Mrs. Finch sat in the front row, her heart swelling with pride as he walked across the stage. By then, their bond had deepened into something unbreakable. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was family. Not long after Timothy started his first job as a social worker, Mrs. Finch passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news hit Timothy hard, but as he read the letter she had left for him, he realized her presence would always be with him. "Dear Timothy, I may not be there to see all the wonderful things you'll accomplish, but I know in my heart that you will continue to make the world a better place. You've already done so for me. Never forget that the smallest act of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives in ways you may never see. Carry that lesson with you, and you will honor everything we've shared. With all my love, Eleanor Finch." At her memorial service, Timothy stood before the attendees, his voice steady despite the tears glistening in his eyes. "She taught me that kindness has the power to heal, to connect, and to change the world," he said. "She believed in me when I needed it most, and I will spend the rest of my life living up to the example she set." As the years went on, Timothy became a dedicated social worker, helping families and individuals find hope during their darkest moments. In his office, he kept 2 mementos: the framed letter Mrs. Finch had given him that first Christmas, and the wooden heart ornament that read "Your family too." Though Mrs. Finch was no longer there to witness it, her kindness lived on in every life Timothy touched. It was a legacy that began with a knock on the door, a shared meal, and the profound power of human connection. And in that legacy, Eleanor Finch's spirit remained. a timeless reminder that love and kindness are the greatest gifts of all. And that was a simple story that teaches us how small acts of kindness can truly change lives. If this story touched your heart, we hope you'll spread its message far and wide. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share it with others to keep the kindness going, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories. Remember, a small act of kindness can write an entirely new story.